Good morning and welcome to Redeemer Lutheran Church. I'm Pastor Gary Lodeholt. When I was a child, I made the newspaper. I don't really remember this, but my family and I were vacationing at Luther Ridge in the mountains, and it must have been a very rainy time because one day, wearing my yellow raincoat with hood, I stepped out of our lodging with my hand held out, looking to the sky to see if it were still raining. A newspaper photographer happened to be there and took my picture, and it made the paper. It had to have been raining a lot if a kid sticking out his hand to see if it was raining made the newspaper. That all came to mind because of this past week's rain. Not that we had too much, but because we needed it so badly. In fact, one evening last week I just took a book out on our porch so I could listen to the rain as I read. All that got me thinking about the weather in the Bible. I remember learning with surprise when I was planning my trip to Israel that Charleston and Jerusalem are at almost identical latitudes, so the temperatures we have here are pretty much the temperatures they have there. There's only one major difference. We tend to get a lot more rain than they do. In fact, I remember our tour guide telling us that in Israel, rain was considered a blessing. And that would have been particularly true in Bible times when livelihoods were dependent on being able to grow crops. Perhaps you remember that in the Old Testament there was a lot of conflict with people who worshipped Baal. Baal was a fertility god to whom they prayed for rain. Of course, from the Bible's perspective, it wasn't Baal who caused the rain, but God. I began to think of how dependent they were on the rain, and then that made me curious about the times in the Bible when rain was part of the story. That's what we hope to look at this week. Times in the Bible when rain is involved in the story. And today I want to begin with one of my favorite stories in the Bible, the stilling of the storm in Mark 4. This story took on special significance for me on my trip to Israel. We were out in a boat on the Sea of Galilee, and our tour guide stopped the boat, and we were simply bobbing in the water out in the middle of the lake. As the waves lapped gently at the boat, he invited us to scan the shoreline. While we didn't notice anything particularly unusual, he then pointed out how the Sea of Galilee sits in something of a large depression. And in fact, the entire lake was ringed with large hills rising up from the water. Because of the hills, storms can arise and arrive suddenly without people on the lake being aware they are coming. The wind and the rain can make a ferocious rush down the slopes and create fierce winds and rains and waves that threaten everything in their path. And it must have been something like that when that storm threatened the boat with Jesus and the disciples. In fact, it must have been terribly fierce because some of those disciples were fishermen who made their living on this lake, and even they were afraid. So they must have been amazed at how Jesus stilled the storm. The way the Bible talks about it, they ask themselves, "Who is this?" One of my favorite paintings is by Rembrandt, and it's called The Storm on the Sea of Galilee. The waves are huge, and the boat is canted up at a steep angle riding those waves. Some disciples are bailing water, and there's even one who's being sick over the side. A few others have just woken Jesus to help them. It's a dramatic picture, but there's something else that's really very powerful in this painting. If you count the people in the boat, there are 14. And that doesn't make sense because Jesus plus 12 disciples means that there should be 13 in the boat. On closer examination, you will find that Rembrandt painted himself into the boat along with the disciples. He's one of the ones very near Jesus. Rembrandt was perhaps telling us that in the winds and rains of our lives, being near Jesus is the only place to be. Thanks for watching, and remember to let this day belong to God.